thanks for inviting me, and yeah, what a great conference. And I'm honored to give the last talk, and hopefully I will bring the conference to an interesting end. So I will do my best. I hope it's not irritating. I have the slides on this screen and the camera is here on my little laptop, so I will be looking in this direction, but I hope it's not too irritating. I will talk about a project which I'm doing together with Andreas Ostermeier and Matthias Uhl. It's about AI-powered advisors, or more specifically, AI-powered moral advisors. And even though it says here that we are at the Faculty of Computer Science, we are not computer scientists. So we are social scientists trying to study ethical and social and behavioral implications of human-machine interactions in the broadest sense. This project is a start for us on this topic. We try to approach this topic from several perspectives and with different methodologies, from lab experiments to field experiments. And today I will present a vignette study. Maybe let me start what the talk is not about. The talk is not about whether or not AI should be allowed to become ethical or full ethical agents, from an ethical perspective. And the talk will not be about whether or not AI will ever be able to become full ethical agents from an engineering or technological perspective. The talk is about a behavioral perspective. What would ethical advice of AI be considered by users, and what would be the requirements for the design of AI? And one element that appears very often, or that appears to be important for many people when it comes to applications of AI, is trust. And in the eyes of researchers, but also the public. And I collected a few sentences during this conference where this becomes obvious. One of the questions on topic 1 of the homepage of Social Bridges is, will we be able to trust our artificial counterparts? Merely you said when you introduced the first keynote, Philip Kellmeyer, you said that in your opinion, one of the key questions in the field of AI is whether or not we can establish trust in human AI interactions. And Philip Kellmeyer himself talked about trust. Today, Yet Rahwan talked how to trust a machine. But you also find this trust in guidelines, such as in guidelines of the VDE, the German Association for Electrical, Electronic and Information Technologies. Trust in the functioning of AI is an essential building block. And or from IEEE, trust will be essential to the widespread adoption of autonomous and intelligent systems. And they go on to say, with black boxes playing influential roles, trust will be difficult to earn. So this is a second issue, that apparently transparency or explainability might be a factor to reach trust in AI or in AI applications. And this is a last sentence from the strategy paper of the German government on AI. Explainability and transparency of AI are key to the trust in AI. So here we have the two issues in one sentence. So it appears that when it's about applications of AI, that trust is an issue here, and transparency is one factor to reach trust in AI. So this is what this talk is about. It touches on trust and transparency. So, but why moral advice? Well, of course, AI-based advices are used in many domains, from personal recruitment to allocation of loans, penal sentencing, predictive maintenance, and so on and so forth. And not in all, but in many of those cases, there are ethical issues involved. Algorithms turn into ethical agents, shaping our moral behavior. So this alone might be a motivation to study the effect of moral advice. But there is another issue that touches on this transparency and trust, which I mentioned earlier, that if, or in some of these applications of AI, when it's about, let's say, face recognition or object recognition, probably allocation of loans or predictive maintenance, then maybe it's actually important. The performance of the AI is important, and the performance can be measured. And maybe I don't care so much how exactly the AI actually functions in this particular context, but as long as it does its job. then it's okay. But when it comes to moral or ethical decision making, of course, there are not such things like performance measures. It's about underlying ethical principles, and then you would expect that transparency is more important. So if you would like to study the factors like transparency or trust in AI, how this affects actually then the use of AI, then ethical or moral decision making might actually be a good thing to study those effects. Yeah. So, as I said, we used the vignettes, or we implemented a vignette study, and in those studies, participants are presented scenarios, and they are asked questions about these scenarios. So here is a particular scenario that we used. Suppose you are responsible for recruitment in a company, you have one vacancy to fill and 2 applicants shortlisted for the job. One applicant is a friend of yours, the other is a stranger. You find the stranger more eligible, but you feel also obliged to your friend. There is an impartial moral advisor who will tell you whether it's ethically acceptable to decide in favor of a friend in such situations. The applicants do not know about the advisor, and no one will ever learn whether you followed the advice. According to the advisor, it is not acceptable to hire your friend. So participants were presented scenarios such as this, and then they had to assess the following statement. I would hire the stranger, not my friend. The stranger is actually more eligible, as it says here, but of course there's also the friend. And they could assess this statement on a slider between 0 and 100, where 0 was fully disagree. So I disagree that I would hire the stranger, not my friend. I neither agree nor disagree. 50 was labeled with this, and 100 was labeled with I fully agree. So I would probably hire the stranger, not my friend. And all these vignettes were actually of the same structure. So the first paragraph was the context. We had actually different context that we used. The second paragraph was about the advisor, and the third paragraph, the single sentence, was the advice. In this case, it was what we call the ethical advice here. It simply said, according to the advisor, it is not acceptable to hire a friend. And we had 2 different advices here. The ethical advice, it's not acceptable. And the other advice was the unethical advice, saying that it is acceptable to hire a friend. And then the important paragraph, the second one, where we actually manipulate the advisor. Here in this case, it's a human advisor, actually an impartial moral advisor, who tells you whether it's ethically acceptable to decide in favor of a friend in such situations. And when we use an AI-based advisor, we simply say there is an AI-powered algorithm that will tell you whether it's ethically acceptable to decide in favor of a friend in such situations. Okay, this actually is not very transparent so far. When it comes to the algorithm, you have no clue how this algorithm gives or how it comes to the advice. So for the algorithm, we added another sentence, and we wanted to start with an algorithm that comes as close as possible to a human advisor. So we simply said that the algorithm imitates human decisions based on the ethical judgments of impartial human advisors in such situations. This is almost as close as you can get in comparison to the human advisor. In this human treatment, it was there's an impartial human advisor telling you whether it's ethically acceptable, and here it's the algorithm imitating human decisions based on the ethical judgments of impartial human advisors. And so we had 3 different scenarios. You saw the scenario in recruiting, but we also had a scenario in the health domain. It was about kidney donations, or actually compiling the waiting list of kidney donations. One scenario on money laundering, law prosecuting. And we had 2 different advices, the ethical and the unethical advice, and we manipulated the advisor. So a human versus an AI-based advisor, and several variants of this. So one experimental condition was a specific scenario, a specific advice, and a specific advisor. And each participant saw only one, or was assigned to only one condition. So it's a between subjects design. For each experimental condition, we invited 65 participants. And we were aiming at 50 eligible participants. Yeah, typically in vignette studies like this, you ask, or you would like to check the attention and the comprehension of the participants. So you ask a few control questions at the end of the survey. And here I call eligible are those participants who actually answer the control questions correctly. And then all the data that I present, all the results are based on those eligible participants who were able to answer the control questions correctly. We invited participants via cloud research and randomly assigned them to the experimental conditions via Qualtrics, and we pre-registered all studies on aspredicted.org. In total, in all studies that I present today, we had 2,017 subjects completing one of our surveys, and of those, roughly 1,600 were eligible, meaning that they were able to answer the control question. And then, of course, at the end of the survey, we asked a few demographic questions. So 43% were male, with a mean age of 44, ranging between 18 and 93 years. And we also had this one question where we asked participants to rate themselves compared to others, how ethical they think they are compared to others in this survey. Again, on a slider between 0 and 100, where 0 means I'm least ethical, 50 as ethical as others, and 100 I am most ethical. And well, on average, participants thought that they are more ethical than the other participants. So in the psychological literature, we know that people typically are overconfident. They think their abilities are above average. And here, regarding the ethical behavior, it appears to be a similar thing. Okay. So here are the results of study one. Just as a reminder, here we compare the effect of the advice when the advice is from an AI advisor, and the AI advisor is actually very close to a human advisor. It samples the AI-based advisor, samples human impartial moral advisors. And we compare the effect of this advice to the scenarios where the advisor was in fact a human, an impartial moral advisor. And what you see here on the left side in this figure, you see the assessment of the participants to this regarding this statement. I would favor the stranger, not my friend. And it appears the gray bar is the assessment when they saw an ethical advice. It is not acceptable to hire your friend. And this light gray bar is when they received unethical advice. It is acceptable to hire your friend. And we see that in both actually the human, when the advice came from the human directly, and when the advice came from an AI advisor, which sampled human advice, actually the advice indeed has an influence on their judgment. So when they receive ethical advice, they tend to refuse a favor to the friend stronger than when they received unethical advice. And so the advice has an influence on the judgment and on their judgments. And what we see here in the regression, we see that ethical advice has a significant effect, and this effect is not different when the advice is from an AI-based advisor that samples human advice. So, which is probably good news. So the AI advisor that comes as close to a human advisor as possible is able to be, or is able to substitute the human advice. And here those numbers, if we, so 0 was labeled, I disagree with this statement, I would favor the stranger. 50 was labeled, I neither agree nor disagree. So when we look at the proportion of people who actually stated judgment below 50, so who favor the friend, then and we will compare those proportions, we see that actually the advice has an effect not only on the judgment, but on the supposed behavior. So if they receive ethical advice, roughly 20% would actually favor the friend in those situations. And when they receive unethical advice, this proportion almost doubles. So, okay, so AI might substitute humans as moral advisors. This is the key message of the first study. So in the second study, we wanted to know, okay, what if we increase, what if we decrease transparency? what if we make the rationale of the AI-based advice unknown? So here, once again, this was the advisor in study 1. The algorithm imitates human decisions based on the ethical judgments of impartial human advisors in such situations. And in study 2, we substituted this sentence with the sentence, we made it explicit. It is unknown what the algorithm's advice is based on. And here the results. Here, this is the data from the first study, just for comparison. So we had, it was fully intransparent how the advisor gave, or the rationale of the advisor, why he gave the advice that he is given, or it. And we see that ethical advice is indeed, again, influential on the judgment. When they receive ethical advice, they tend to refuse the favor to the friend stronger than when they receive unethical advice. And when we compare this opaque AI with the advice of the human advisor in the first study, we see that overall the ethical advice has an impact on the judgment. But once again, it's not statistically different if this advice comes from an AI advisor. Even in this study too, they are not given any rationale why the advisor is giving a particular advice. So it appears actually that opaqueness is not a big issue to our participants, which is a bit surprising, as it's usually assumed that transparency is very important. So in study 3, we wanted to push this point a bit more to the extreme, and we now actually let the AI-based advisor sample the advice from convicted criminals. So instead of in study 2, we said it's unknown what the algorithm's advice is based on. We now said, okay, the algorithm imitates human decisions based on the ethical judgments of convicted criminals in such situations. This is probably where you would expect that participants actually ignore this advice. I mean, and then to make sure that there is not some strange argument that convicted criminals, especially when it comes to friends, they have some strange code of honor or something like this. We compared this AI advisor who samples ethical judgments of convicted criminals directly to convicted criminals. So if the advice comes from a convicted criminal. And this is what we see here. This again, those two bars are actually the advice coming from the convicted criminal, him or herself. And here we see actually what we would expect, that this advice is simply ignored. It doesn't influence the judgment of the participants. However, if the advice comes from an AI-powered algorithm sampling convicted criminals, this advice influences the judgments of the participants. And this is also what is shown here in the regression. Ethical advice in the human treatment doesn't have a significant effect on the judgment. However, it does have a significant effect in the AI treatment. And here again, also we see in the human treatment, when the advice is from a convicted criminal, it also doesn't change the proportion of people who would favor the friend, whereas when it comes from the AI, it indeed increases the proportion who would hire the friend when they see an unethical advice. So it appears that AI-based advice still works when it actually shouldn't. And the last results slide is we also asked them, after they made their judgment, we asked the participants if there were no ethical advice, whether they think they would have made a different judgment. Yes, no. And whether they think most other participants would have made a different judgment if there were no ethical advice. And what we see here is that in actually all the treatments, it's the same patterns, that they think that the advice did not influence them, but of course, always the other participants. The advice influenced the other participants, but not me. So to conclude, AI-based advice is taken into account even on issues in which AI is usually not considered to be superior. This is probably good news. So AI can replace human advisors and promote better or more ethical decisions. However, what is a bit surprising is that transparency or the specific design of AI does not seem to play a major role in this regard, at least in our study. So the problem might actually, from a user perspective, the problem might not be a lack of trust in AI, but an over-reliance. And this also questions a common response to concerns about the use of AI in sensitive matters. It's always used that as long as the human is in the loop, as long as the human makes the decision, everything is fine. To some extent, this might be a bit naive if we take our findings literally. If users of AI advice trust the AI actually too easily, too much, then this response doesn't really work anymore. So, and here, okay, to conclude, so what could be possible solutions? Well, we could, of course, just trust in the goodwill and competence of companies to create only trustworthy AI, but this is probably naive as well. Or we could demand governmental or central agencies to verify and ensure the trustworthiness of AI, which might actually overburden regulators. Or maybe, I don't know, maybe it's the only way out, it's to promote AI literacy of users. Okay, thank you very much. This was the last.
Thank you so much. That was it was wonderful, and thank you for keeping to time. Makes my heart very warm. We have a couple questions for you, so I'm just going to hop straight into those. Niels Kurvis asks a question from study 1. Why do you equate impartiality with ethicality? Isn't it a trade-off between one moral norm, fairness, versus another, loyalty, and not between ethicality versus unethicality?
Well, regarding impartial, we didn't want that the participants thought that the advisor is some kind of advisor of a company, if it's a recruiting context, and you are responsible for the recruiting, and you have access to an advisor. And we actually, this impartial, we wanted to, or we didn't want that participants think that this might be an advisor implemented of the company, so that they actually, so that you as the recruiter actually make decisions in line with the company. That's why we said it's an impartial advisor. And what was the second question about ethical and unethical?
He said, isn't it a trade-off between one moral norm, which is fairness, versus another, loyalty, and not between ethicality and unethicality?
That's certainly the case. And in fact, I mean, we call it ethical and unethical, but of course, in the scenarios, what we presented to the subjects, there was no wording of ethical or unethical. And in fact, it doesn't even matter what you think is the ethical advice. But what we see is that it influences people's judgments. We don't change the scenario. So once they receive the advice, it's okay to hire a friend. And once they receive it, it's not okay. Whichever you want to label ethical or unethical actually doesn't matter much. I would say it influences your judgment.
We have the next question, which says, related to the second study, artificial agents need some predefined objective. What could be an objective on an algorithmic moral advisor?
They need an objective. Okay, I'm not sure what I understand. I guess this is a question how to design an artificial moral advisor, which I'm not sure whether we actually are trying to approach here. I'm not sure whether I understand this question correctly. It's just however the advisor is designed, this AI-based advisor, if people what do they know about the advisor, and does it influence their decisions? How, as from an engineering perspective, how you would design such an advisor, I have no clue.
I think so. He's got a clarification. He says, "What is the moral advisor's goal from an engineering point of view?" Yes, and he says this is not related to your research question specifically. He's asking for your insight.
I guess this is actually why we I think we chose a very simple solution. We just said in the first study, it just samples human the advice of impartial moral advisors of human moral advisors. So I guess I'm not even sure whether you'd call it AI-based advisor. But so okay, this was our simple solution that we didn't have to care that we have to explain much to the participants. And when it comes to my opinion, I honestly I don't know how. I'm not sure. I don't know.
You're allowed not to know. That's fine. He says that's clear. So you answered it sufficiently.
Okay.
Niels Kerbis, who had the question about fairness and loyalty, just lets you know that there might be a relevant paper, which is popped in the chat if you're interested, but it's the whistleblower's dilemma and the fairness loyalty trade-off. So if you're interested in following up on that, that's there. There is another question. Did you find any demographic insights into who is likely to use the advisor, human or algorithmic, to make these decisions?
Yeah, and I stay on this slide because here we have the variables that we actually collected, and actually none of the demographic variables had an influence, neither age. I think in one regression we had a gender or a sex effect, but it wasn't robust. So I don't. So we didn't find any of the demographic variables influencing the judgment. Only moral self-assessment. The question: do you, compared to the other subjects in this survey, do you think you're more or less ethical? This variable had an impact on the judgment overall, but there was no interaction between the advice and this variable. So on average, the more you think, the more ethical you think you are, the more you refuse to favor your friend. It's very straightforward, I guess.
So I think that sort of answers a question that Jürgis had asked, which was, did participants' decisions to rely on the advisor depend on how ethical they rated themselves to be? And I think that's what you've just said. So you preempted his question. And then I sort of had a quick methodological question. Yeah. I'm sorry if I missed this. Was this a fully repeated measures design? So did every participant capture each of the if it's 4 or 6 vignettes, I can't remember how many factors in each of the study, but did they get each? And do you look at then individual differences between the conditions?
No, each participant was assigned to only one condition, so it was fully in between. Yeah.
I'd be curious because we've made some comparisons in these one shot versus the fully repeated, and sometimes things are relative. Let's put it that way. And I think that if faced with the two options, irrespective of order, I mean, there may also be an order effect, but irrespective of order, maybe you would tease something out there that might be, yeah.
I'm not sure, but my guess would be that actually the design that we chose is a worst case scenario to find an effect. If you would have manipulated within participants whether they received the advice of an AI advisor or of a human subject, of course, we would have made them aware of this category, of this dimension, and they might actually then probably respond to this supposedly or dimension. And here they only saw one actually of the conditions. So I guess actually it's more.
There are definitely pros and cons for both approaches. I was just curious because I think that there might be some difference. And then I've got another question. Sorry. Yes. So the suggestion. This is a question suggestion. Would the results be different if the advice was determined by a coin toss and the participants were told that?
That's a good question. I think that we thought about whether we should implement something like this, and we decided to go against it because this might actually, but saying that the AI or saying that the advisor flips a coin, this might actually a value judgment. This might be a value judgment, and this is something what we wanted to, or what we didn't want to have. So this might actually signal to the subjects, well, ethically, it doesn't matter. You can do whatever. So I don't know, but I'm not sure whether there's also pros and cons. And then there would be confounding factors, I guess, in this treatment.
It's always the problem, is it? Study design comes with, oh, I wish I had done that, but then that would, So I realize we have actually taken up your full amount of time. So to ensure that you get your dinner properly, we will let you go. And thank you once again for joining us, for bringing our 3-day event to a close on such a high point with such exciting data. Does this exist in a preprint or published form, was a final question. And if so, could you pop it into the live chat?
Yes, we are very close to finalizing the paper, I'm not sure whether we have a final version. Actually, I don't think so. But we want to submit it soon. So, and as soon as this, I will try to give the information as soon as we have a paper.